Okay guys, we're going to try in like 20-25 minutes handle some nationalism in Russia. I hope that you can see this. We're going to have a lot of Alexanders and a lot of Nicholases here. So by the year 1800, Russia is one of the largest and most densely populated, well, it is the largest and most densely populated country in all of Europe. And as a result, it is blessed with just an incredible amount of natural resources for heavy industry, like coal, like iron ore, things that you need for industrialization. And the sheer size of the country, running from the Baltic Sea in Northern Europe to the Black Sea, all the way over to the Pacific coast in Asia, Russia literally gives validity to the term Eurasia, the combined Europe and Asian continents. And it should give it global influence. However, because of that sheer size and distance from everyone else, Russia was rarely accepted and most times rejected by the West. You know, going back to Peter the Great, people in the West just did not like the old world style of government. Russia was trapped in time. They were still almost practicing like medieval feudalism. We've had a couple of good czars, Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, who tried to bring modernization and westernization to Russia. But every time one of these great Jedis like Peter and Catherine go by the wayside, the Russian nobles, the Russian boyars, drag it back down. So it's not only the boyars, but also weak czars. And these guys were conservative. They were afraid that any attempts at modernization will threaten their absolute position of their authority. So they don't want change. Even though it's not working, we're going to stick to it. Over in the West, all right, the Enlightenment and the French Revolution had encouraged reforms in other parts of Europe. But these things have no effect whatsoever on Mother Russia. They just don't. And in 1800, whoops, come on now. All right, well, if we're not going to work, we will just do it manually. By 1800, there, as you can see, the gigantic size of Mother Russia. By 1800, Tsar Alexander I, the king of the Russian Empire, a Romanov, had thought about making reforms. You know, this might actually be a good idea. But when Napoleon invades Russia in 1812, he changes his mind about that. It scares him. And when the Napoleonic Wars were over, at the Congress of Vienna, Tsar Alexander agrees with Clemens von Metternich, all right? We will suppress any thought, any action, anything to do whatsoever that will threaten my monarchy. My family's been in charge for hundreds of years, and that's what we are going to continue to do. Now, a few years later, 10 years later, in 1825, Alexander I dies. And a group of his army officers who fought against Napoleon learned of Western ideas and Western reforms. And they lead a revolt in December known as the Decembrist Revolt, demanding democratic reforms in their country. The new Tsar, Alexander's son, Nicholas I, does what we always do in Russia. He brutally puts down these rebellions. He goes Peter the Great on the boyars. He drops the hammer on them. And then he outlaws. You know, he gets out the How to Be a Dictator for Dummies, and he runs the playbook. He outlaws Western books. He takes teachers and intellectuals who could teach people to think for themselves, and he throws them in jail. And then he uses his secret police, the Streltsy, to root out, to ferret out, and find people who oppose his regimes. I'm going to find you, I'm going to destroy you, throw you in jail, make you disappear, you name it. And Tsar Nicholas I is going to build Russia on 3 pillars. He's going to reassert his absolutism based on 3 things. Number 1 is orthodoxy. In order to control the hearts and the minds of our people, there must be strong ties between the church and the government. The church can influence the people, so we are really going to strengthen the ties between the Russian Orthodox Church and the monarchy. Number 2, he believed in autocracy. Unquestioned absolute rule, the absolute power of my government. Like my ancestor Peter the Great, I am in charge and you are going to deal with it. And number 3 is respect for nationalism. Be proud of Russian. Be proud of vodka and borscht and caviar and Fabergé eggs and stacking dolls and the might and the strength of the mighty Russian people. Any group who disagrees with the Tsar is eliminated. They are done. But Nicholas is a smart guy. He does see the need to modernize his country. We got to do things to keep up. That's what my great ancestor Peter was going to do. I got to make some necessary economic reforms to compete with the West. Problem is, how do I do it without upsetting those stinking boyars? What am I going to do? I got 3 pillars: orthodoxy, absolutism, and nationalism. But what can I do? In still seeking that permanent warm water port, Nicholas gets involved in the Korean War in 1853. In the middle of it, Tsar Nicholas I dies in 1855. And he brings in his son, Tsar Alexander II. And on his deathbed, Nicholas says, "Oh, Alexander, I wanted to take everything that was hard and difficult and trying and put it on my shoulders. I wanted to leave you a peaceful, well-ordered, happy realm. Unfortunately, my son, I leave you a very poor state indeed." And he then dies. All right? I pray for Russia and for all of you. And Alexander II is like, "Thanks, Dad, you got me involved into a war, and you tell me the country, while you want to do everything that was hard, you leaving me a country that pretty much sucks. Great. Awesome. Thank you." So Alexander II, however, sees what's happening. And when he is defeated in the debacle that is the Crimean War, Alexander II says, "Finally, here is the proof. Reforms are not only possible, but guys, they're necessary. We just got hammered by the French and the English and the Ottomans. We've got to do something." And many of his people were saying the same thing. We demand reform. So in 1861, again, this is all happening contextually right around the United States Civil War, he announces an end to the centuries-old policies of serfdom in Russia. Peasants were like slaves. They could be bought and sold. Some paid gambling debts. Many lived in like little Yoda-like huts, and they used stretched pig bladders for windows. That's not going to keep out the cold and the snow and the rain. So look, serfdom is done. Everybody else had abolished feudalism in Europe years before, but finally in 1861, there are no more serfs. And this really makes the boyars unhappy. And while just saying that is in effect President Lincoln making the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery is outlawed in all states that are in rebellion. There's no immediate effect whatsoever. The people were freed, but now what? Some of them were given some land. They were given plots of land. But it wasn't big enough for them to grow enough food to feed and support their families to pay their taxes. Plus, they weren't just given the land, all right? They had to eventually pay it off. They were given mortgages 50 years to pay off the loan of this land. So you give us land that's not big enough for us to survive, and we got to pay you for it? This sucks. And so getting rid of serfdom also means the Russian government is going to have to reorganize itself. Who's going to be in charge? Instead of the boyars being in charge, local village officials known as zemstrovos. Zemstrovos are locals, like Bob in the GM factory. They are now going to collect taxes. They are going to be in charge of, maintaining infrastructure. They're going to be in charge of providing education. And these zemstrovos are going to oversee everything. And a new judicial system is created. And all this stuff sounds good in theory. It's like educational philosophy. I'll sit in an ivory tower think tank and think stuff up that sounds good, but we don't test its practical application. And so while new modern industry was encouraged, we got to figure out what everybody else is doing. So once again, Russia sends its young men and women to head west. Find out what's going on in the West and bring those ideas back, much like Peter the Great had done years before. A lot of these guys don't return, and many of these reforms just don't work out. Nothing really helps. Nothing really works. And there are problems with this. When Tsar Alexander makes these reforms, everybody's pumped. Everybody is excited. But all of a sudden, when his reforms don't work, these high expectations and hopes and dreams of the people turn to anger, especially among the younger students. Remember, the revolutions in France and in Latin America and in the United States were caused by an unrest of the middle class. Well, here comes the students and other intellectuals. And they channel their anger into a movement that across the world in the 1870s becomes known as populism. All right, think of wicked. I want to be popular. Well, populism, speaking of wicked, is supposed to be, in Frank L. Baum's classic, The Wizard of Oz, supposed to be like the cowardly lion is, the cowardly, governments that are ineffective. The Tin Man is the unemployed industrial workers. The Scarecrow is the out-of-work farmers, and Dorothy is like hope or something like that. Well, populism in Russia is a grassroots movement, right, that believes that all people should be equal. And we got to start this at the ground level. Now, the populist movement in Russia is known as Land and Freedom. Land and Freedom. And it was heavily influenced by the writings of Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. And Land and Freedom wants a movement known as a revolution founded on communal life, where we're all going to be equal. And the idea is that Land and Freedom is going to be made up of students who are going to go out into the countryside, and they're going to educate these Russian peasants. Well, imagine if I took you guys, my lax bros, and I sent you into the outreaches of the county. Here comes a backwards baseball hat, hemp bracelet wearing, flip-flop wearing, jam short wearing frat bro going into rural areas. They're going to be like, boy, who are you? What are you doing? You must be from Chapel Hill. And there's going to be some tension, all right? These students want to educate the bulk of the society to gain their trust. But the peasants don't trust these students. Who are you? You're an outsider. I don't know you. You're here to cause trouble. And so the peasants turn the students who are just trying to help them, the frat bros, over to the Russian authorities. The police arrest him. But Tsar Alexander is lenient. Says, look, guys, that was funny. I'm going to give you a slap on the wrist. I'm going to give you just a little tap, but don't let this happen again. If it happens again, I'm not going to let you go the second time. The hammer will drop swiftly and surely. And so after this crackdown, many people of the land and freedom movement begin to split apart. Like, it's not going to work, it's a great idea, but it's really not working. And what's left are the radicals, the hardcore people. And in 1879, they form a new group known as the People's Will. It is the will of the people that we will break through and we will change Russian history. And they were dedicated not only to just a reforming of the government, but a complete and total overthrow of the Tsarist regime. They've got to go. And the only way to do this is to assassinate them. And so the reign of Tsar Alexander II is remembered for two things. Number one, his well-intentioned but botched attempts at reform. Number one. Well-intentioned but botched attempts at reform, and the major opposition against him. Whatever he tries just makes people more angry. So, he's going to go by the wayside, and that's going to bring up his son, Alexander III. When it happens, eventually, Alexander is going to rule more like his grandfather, Nicholas. Alexander II will be assassinated. This makes Alexander III really, really, really mad. So he responds to the assassination swiftly and brutally. When he tracks down and finds his dad's assassins, he quickly executes them. And he repeals all of his dad's well-intentioned reforms. Think of Louis XIV revoking the Edict of Nantes and then some. And Alexander III decides to increase the power of the Tsar by strengthening his central government. He's going to increase the power of his secret police, and he unleashes them on his people. In his plan, very nationalist, is to attack anything that is not Russian. Suppress any culture of non-Russian people. And he says, in Russia, we are going to have one language, one church, and one government. One language, one church, one government. It's how we are going to do things. And these actions only further confirm and cement in the minds of the revolutionaries that the absolute monarchy in Russia has to go. We're not going to respect anybody else. One language, one religion, one government. I don't know, man. You know, Poles, Czechs, Romanians, this is going to be a little different. So, the absolute government can no longer have direct control over the people. And what this does, Alexander III really seals the fate of his family, which his descendants will all be assassinated during World War I and the Russian Revolution. Tsar Alexander III will sow the seeds of doom for his family. In 1917, 1918, the great Romanov dynasty ends. And so nationalism is going to have an enormous impact on the reforms of Germany and Italy. Right? It is going to realign the power structure of Central Europe. Old world multicultural monarchies like the Austrian Habsburgs are gone. The Ottoman Empire is fading. Russia is just about done. But Russia, or nationalism, is going to reverberate around the world. Again, for context, we are experiencing our own era of nationalism here in the United States with the Great Civil War going on between North and South. And we're going to head over to Asia, where there are nationalism movements going on over there. But one last thing about nationalism. We've got these three big empires, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia. All three of them have a large number of ethnic Poles from Poland in their countries. Plus, they have a minimum of at least two other ethnic groups, maybe like Czechs, maybe Slovaks within them. All of these groups, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, want their own countries. They've got nationalistic ideas. And each ethnic group is focused solely upon themselves. Right? They don't really look at how they fit into the great empire. They're not UVA basketball anymore. And it is these populations that will have a major effect on the Austria-Hungarian, the Russian, and the German empires. And nationalism will be the first spark that will ignite the explosion that is World War I. And World War I is what I like to call one of the great door hinges of history, the Percy Jackson effect, where England, Western Europe, had dominated the globe since Columbus got lost. They were the creditors of the world. The power structures flowed through them. The United States, even with an industrialization and Thanksgiving, well, we were sitting at the rickety card table in the corner. We weren't at the adults' table. And after World War I, all right, the old monarchical past is gone. The door is slammed shut. The Romanov dynasty, gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, gone. The Ottoman Empire, gone. England and France have lost a lot of manpower. France and Belgium are physically ruined. And everybody, Germany, France, and England, are pretty much financially broke. So like Percy Jackson's Greek gods, the gods move from Europe over to the United States. The United States will assume a greater role in history. And not only is the United States sitting at the adults' table, but at the head of the adults' table. The door hinge, Clemens von Metternich wanted to preserve it. Well, a little over 100 years later, it was gone. So that is it for nationalism in Europe, guys. I really hope you watch and listen to these. And I will see you guys on Monday.